our lovely building, Melbourne. Today is an interesting day. We have wonderful guest speakers who are going to talk about the multicultural mental health. I would like to introduce our first guest speaker, who is Yeung. Can you all hear me at the back? Fantastic. Yeah. Yeung qualified as a social worker in 1989. Having studied in Hong Kong, has worked as a Chinese social worker in Liverpool for 10 years. Yeung's research interest lies in the field of health and social care minority ethnic groups. She has conducted a number of studies to explore different ways of involving service users and the carers from minority ethnic communities in training social worker students. Yeung is presently undertaking her PhD study, The Pathway to Mental Health Care for Chinese People Suffering from Severe Mental Health in England. I'd like to introduce Yeung. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. This presentation is about my PhD study, which I'm currently working on. I'm in the process of conceptualizing the findings. I think I'm nearly there, although I'm not 100% sure. So please try to be helpful with me and during the question time, and any constructive comment will be very welcome. Okay, so what I'll be talking about in these 20 minutes, I will first briefly talk about some of the features of Chinese population in Britain, what is known and unknown about the use of mental health services. Then I will talk about the research design and share part of the findings of this study. The Chinese first arrived in this country in the 19th century. Many of them worked in the shipping companies, and therefore the early settlements they were near major seaports such as London, Cardiff, and Liverpool. In year 2001, there were about over 247,000 Chinese living in this country, which made up 0.4% of the total population. The census of the year 2011 census will be available this summer, and we shall have more updated information about the population. According to the census, year 2001 census, about 30% of the population were born in this country. Another 29% came from Hong Kong, 19% from mainland China, 15% from Southeast Asian countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Nearly 50% of the Chinese population, they work in catering-related business. As the nature of the catering industry discourage concentration of the population, the Chinese tend to disperse across the country, with about 37% of them living in London and Greater London, and some small cluster in major cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool. Because the Chinese made different journey to come to this country, they have different political, economic, and social backgrounds. They also speak different dialects, and the English language skills also vary. Therefore, diversity exists within this population. Use of mental health services. Many studies have found that minority ethnic groups are generally overrepresented in mental health system in England. However, the Chinese are less likely to report psychological distress and to seek help from primary health care for mental health related problems. When it comes to the use of inpatient mental health services, Chinese people are more likely to be admitted to the hospital for compulsory admissions and more likely to be referred to specialist mental health services for A&E. The high detention rates and the higher referral rate from A&E implies that the Chinese group are more likely to come into contact with mental health services in crisis situations, which often results in compulsory admissions. The low rates of use of mental health services at community level and the high level of severity of mental health conditions of those even subsequently come into contact with mental health services suggest that there is an underutilization of mental health services. The issues of underutilization was also observed in the Chinese community living in Australia and America. Some of the reasons for the underutilization could be because of their attitude towards mental health. The supernatural view see mental illness as an invasion of evil spirit. The moralistic views consider mental illness as a kind of punishment for the immoral conduct of a person or one's ancestor. Chinese people living in rural areas in mainland China are more likely to adopt these views. But in recent years, there's an increasing number of Chinese people living in Hong Kong or urban areas in China attribute the cause of mental illness towards different psychological and interpersonal conflicts. The physiological perspective. In traditional Chinese medicines, there is a strong tendency to treat psychological and physiological function of the human bodies as one entity. Physical organs such as liver, lung, and especially the heart are considered to be the focal points for combined psychological and physiological functions. In Chinese language, the heart is frequently used as a metaphor which houses emotions. The close connection of heart and emotion is seen in the construction of many Chinese characters. There are more than 100 Chinese characters used to describe emotions contained the heart symbol. This regular fusion of body and emotion in Chinese language suggests that the body embodiment of Chinese affective distress has a deep and strong cultural structure in our language and socialization. Let me show you some examples to help you understand what I'm talking about. This is the Chinese writing in heart, which can also be written in this way. 感情 is in Chinese and feelings in Chinese. As you can see, both words contain the heart symbol. This is knife. A knife above your heart. You still have to endure. That is what we mean endure in Chinese. Oh, I mean to skip this part. As you can see, I can get carried away with this subject. And personally, I think this subject deserves a PhD attention. And I hope somebody else will take this up. But later on, when I'm sharing some of the findings of the study, I will illustrate how the Chinese language reflects and affects the way of many Chinese people, how they understand and present the experience of psychological and mental distress. Okay, the conceptual framework I use for my study is social network analysis. There are three main reasons for me to use that. The first one is traditional Chinese society emphasizes collectivism and highly regard collective good. So the decision to seek help does not rest with the individual, but they wrongly incorporate the views of different members of a family or close relatives. Hence, how people in close informal network perceive the symptoms and the mental health services affects the duration and direction of the pathway they took to care of one's mental health. Secondly, people with diagnosis of severe mental illness such as schizophrenia often display some behavior which are perceived by other people to be socially disruptive. This behavior also make them more noticeable to those people they come across in social networks. Therefore, social networks play a significant role in directing the pathway experience. Finally, as I said before, a large percentage of the Chinese population were not born in this country, and the population tends to disperse across this country. So many of them may not have easy access to the support network. Social level analysis will help identify who and where are the people that will be getting involved in this pathway. There's a number of network studies to look at people's pathway to mental health care. Some of them look at the size of the network, and they found that a small size of social network was jointly related to the use of inpatient mental health services. When they look into the composition of the social network, in a cross-cultural study, they found that this study involved Chinese Canadians. It found that the presence of family was more likely to result in delayed instead of early contact with mental health services. This is very dissimilar to a study about general population in this country. Another study, which was carried out about more than 30 years ago, which reflects this area is very much under-researched among overseas Chinese when they have a diagnosis with severe mental illness. This study found that only families and close relatives were involved in the early stage of help seeking. And all the participants came into contact with mental health services after a very long period of time, and on average over 5 years. They also found that as repeated relapses and hospitalizations brought shame to the family will gradually leave and abandon the relatives with the diagnosis of mental illness. So the aim of my study was to examine the role of social network in the pathway to the care of mental health of Chinese people living with the diagnosis of severe mental illness in England. This presentation will focus on how the British Chinese give meaning to the experience of mental distress and the impact of this meaning making on the pathway to the care of mental health. The study design, it is a qualitative study. I use phenomenological approach. I'm not going to spend a lot of time to talk about the methodology. If anyone is interested to talk about the methodological aspect of this study, you're more than welcome to talk to me about it over or after lunch. This study, I conduct 55 interviews that concern 16 Chinese people with a diagnosis of severe mental illness. I interviewed 13 Chinese people with the diagnosis. 17 interviews concerned people from the informal network, mainly carers and friends. There were also 21 interviews with Chinese-speaking workers. The participants were recruited for service provider providing mental health support, social care support service for Chinese people with mental illness and their carers. Because of the dispersed Chinese populations, participants were recruited from different parts of England. This is the woman. The characteristic of the participants, I will focus on those with diagnosis of severe mental illness. 16 of them, 11 of them were female, 4 were male. 1 of them were under 25, 4 of them over 60, the rest of them aged between 30 and 59. Place of birth, 5 of them were born in this country. 4 from Hong Kong, another 5 from mainland China, and 3 from Vietnam. The overrepresentation of Chinese people from Vietnam may be because that population had a more traumatized migration experience. English language skills. 6 of the participants spoke no English, 5 had spoke limited English, and 5 of them spoke fluent English. They are all born in this country, right? But when I asked the same question about the family, 13 families said that they spoke no English, and 3 of them spoke only limited English. Diagnosis, 9 of them had diagnosis of schizophrenia, 4 had bipolar affective disorder, and 3 with severe depression. Length of time given the diagnosis. Only 1 participant had mental health history less than 3 years. The rest of them have a relatively long mental health history, which ranged from 7 to over 40 years. So what is the experience? How did they make sense of this experience? So only 2 participants, they used the biomedical framework to describe their experience. They both believed that they had depression when they first sought help, although the diagnosis eventually given were not depression. Both of them were BBC, which means British-born Chinese, and they both initiated help seeking. There's also some participants report that their family members noticed the sudden changes of their behavior, and they sought help from medical professionals quickly. These families tend to describe the behaviors, but none of them refer to the biomedical model to label the conditions. But it is fair to say that their relatives believe that the person were ill because they all sought help from medical professionals. supernatural power, some of the participants mentioned ghosts, demons, evil spirit, or dirty thing. Dirty thing is a term commonly used in Chinese culture that refer to some evil spirits. And they refer to they mention evil spirits that were responsible for the behaviors that drove them crazy. One point to note is that all the participants reported the influence of supernatural power. They all age over 50. An experience of this physical discomfort, the tendency to express emotional distress in physical rather than psychological terms is much stronger in Chinese society than in most Western culture. As I mentioned earlier, this quotation illustrates very well how Chinese language reflects and influences the way some Chinese people understand and communicate their psychological distressful experience. Let's go over this quotation together. So this lady mentions she believes she has some heart problem, basically. When she first went to see the doctor, she doesn't believe she has anything to do with stress or depression. She asked the doctor, why do I lose all my appetites? Why do I have problems with sleeping? I don't know anything about depression. The doctor told her that he saw her. You are not unhappy. Look at you, you are not very happy. It must be stress from work. You work too hard. But this lady said, I didn't believe him at that time. There's nothing wrong with my mental health. It is something wrong with me physically. So to her, her primary concern is about her physical health, is about not having enough sleep, not being able to eat. So it didn't come across to her mood and emotion had anything to do with her physiological discomfort. Referring to the moralistic view, these two quotations reflect how Chinese people found the labeling of mental illness is a stigmatizing experience for the family. The first quotation concerned a husband who went with his wife to see the psychiatrist. He didn't expect to see the interpreter there, but when he saw the interpreter, he was very worried because most interpreters, they come from the local community. And so he was very worried that the fact that this family disgraceful business will be disclosed outside of the family. And this saying about family shameful business should not be discussed outside of the family have been seen quite strongly across a number of the participants I interviewed. As you can see, among all the participants, there's no unified will to give meaning to the experience of mental distress. However, all the participants mentioned that stress from life, such as being an immigrant, stress from work, stress from education, loss of relationship, could contribute the reasons that they become mentally unwell. Even within the same family or the same participant, they hold multiple views to understand the experience of mental distress. So how do this perception of mental distress affect the pathway to care? Right? Contrary to the findings of previous study, not all Chinese people delay seeking help from medical professionals when they or someone they knew experienced mental distress. Some of them did contact their GP shortly, and as soon as they noticed certain changes of behavior. And most of them were referred to specialist mental health services shortly. For those, I don't know, can you follow me? For those who describe their experience as stigmatizing and being possessed by demons, they didn't seek help from medical professionals until a crisis happened, right? So, I applied the concept of social network to help me understand their pathway experience, and I found something very interesting, right? For those who sought help early from medical professionals, although close relatives were involved in the early stage of the pathway, the composition of the social network was much more diverse. Other people from the social network, such as cousins and colleagues, were aware of the distressful experience, and they were able to give advice and support. But for those who delayed help seeking, the social network that were involved were mainly involve either the husbands or parents. When parents are involved, normally it's the father who make the decision about the health care of the relative who experience mental distress. Stigma attached to mental illness can explain the difference in different patterns in the pathway to care. Because the cousins and colleagues are not immediate family, so they are not significantly affected by stigma attached to mental illness. And so these people actually encourage early contact with medical professionals of those affected by mental health problems. On the other hand, if those network ties involve only close relatives such as husbands and parents, delay in seeking help for medical advice was more likely to happen. The moralistic view I mentioned earlier suggests that mental illness could be interpreted as a punishment for the family because of the wrongdoing of the ancestor or improper child-rearing practice. In a patriarchal society, Chinese males are considered to be the head of a household and bear the responsibility to look after their wife and their children. Because of strong stigma attached to mental illness, as the head of the household, that is the father or the husband, they were under more pressure to protect the family honor, as well as concealing their own failure to perform their role as husband and father. This explains why they were more reluctant to seek help outside of the family. So the implication is, to some of the network composition has huge implication on the pathway experience. More importantly, it is the attitudes towards mental health held by these social networks determine when and where these people seek help. Finally, I want to emphasize that the purpose of my study is not to advocate the use of mainstream mental health services is the best or the only way to help people to manage mental distress. What I believe is that people, it doesn't matter what cultural backgrounds they have, they should be given all the information about the nature of different mental health conditions, the possible causes for mental distress, and different options available to help them to manage mental distress so that they can make an informed decision about the care of their mental health. To finish my presentation, I would like to share two quotations from two of my participants. If you can spend a minute to read it, and I will shut up now. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Barbara Smith, a psychotherapist in children and adolescent mental health camps in the 5 boroughs. She's a therapist, also a supervisor in a private practice, also undertaking disaster work in the British Red Cross internationally. Barbara was awarded the High Directorate from the Faculty of Health and Social Science for her research on the transferability of counseling training from one culture to another, focusing on experience around transferability of Western theories and the modern counseling, including how to work with domestic abuse and prevent adult survivors of child abuse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I might need a bit of help here. Ah. The one in the middle. Thank you. You can't see. Slideshow?
Thank you.
My presentation is called A Drop in the Ocean for two reasons. One was that the research took place in a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, So get rid of all your envy issues now. And the other is that it's based on a 104,000 word thesis. And trying to cram this into 20 minutes has been quite difficult. So it really is a snapshot of what went on. And the thesis was entitled The Delivery of Western Counsellor Training in the Maldives Islands, Southeast Asia, and it's a case study. I've never been to the Maldives, and I imagined that I would be working here. That would be where I was living and working, but actually I was working here. This is Malé, which is the capital island of Maldives, and it's 2.2 square miles, and it has a population of 200,000 people. So you can imagine the dense population. And given that the whole country is only, the population is only 300,000 right across the whole country, 2/3 of the population live in on this small island. Just to give you an idea, that's Malé, the aerial view of Malé. So it's like a little sort of Singapore as you go in on the boat. And so this is where it's all at. People want to live there because that's where the infrastructure is, that you get better education, better health service. So essentially the research was about the transferability of a counselling training, a particular counselling training that was devised here in the UK, and whether we could lift it up, carry it 4,000 miles across the world and drop it into a small island in the Indian Ocean. And when I first went, I thought, of course you can. You just tweak it a bit and it'll be fine. And how wrong I was. So one of the main issues was about whether or not you could transfer theories of counselling, Western theories of counselling in a collectivist culture. And other course components were a big issue in counselling training is about the ethical and professional issues of counselling. And then there's the specific issues that clients bring to counselling, and I've chosen just a small number of those specific issues to focus on today. So I'll just move on. With case study methodology, there's a lot of stories come out. So this is based on some of the stories that came out of this research for me. But the methods were 32 interviews, which seemed like a good idea at the time. And I was just thinking about your 55 echo. That's a lot of interviews to come home and transcribe and analyse. Sorry, I've got the wrong... try again. Done it wrong again. Okay. One focus group that was quickly put together. And document analysis, this is a bit underused in case study methodology, but it gave some really excellent data for me. I had students' essays to look at, portfolios to look at, case studies to have a look at, and it brought some really good data. Field notes, 32 typed pages of field notes and 2 small exercise books. And it was a thematic analysis. And the participants were the students that were undertaking the counselling course. I went to the Maldives with an organisation called VSO, Voluntary Services Overseas, and that was a 2-year placement. And the idea was that I would design and deliver a counselling training course and deliver it in the College of Higher Education, which is now the University of Maldives. So it was the students that I was teaching, also the second cohort of students, because one of the things about VSO is the notion of sustainability. If you're working as a VSO volunteer, the idea is that you would train a counterpart while you're there so that it was sustainable after you'd left. So the next cohort was also interviewed. A group of Maldivian counsellors, one traditional healer. The traditional healers in the islands were a bit like our local GPs. There's no sort of notion of going to the doctors in the Maldives. You go to the hospital and the whole family go with you. But if you go to a traditional healer, you'd find a queue of people sitting waiting in the waiting room in the same way that you would as a GP here. And they were still very well used there. One Sharia lawyer, because the law and Islam are inextricably linked, so people had to in counselling, we always look at the law. We look at the way that the law is applies to our work. but the law here clearly wasn't going to apply in Sharia law in the Maldives. A documentary maker, a young man who makes documentaries about social issues. He'd done one on the working with child sexual abuse, one on working with domestic violence, and one on drug use. One gay man, because homosexual is illegal in the Maldives, and a woman bereaved by suicide, because suicide is also illegal. A little bit about the context, because context is really crucial in case study methodology. Maldives Islands is 1,200 small islands in the Indian Ocean, and only 200 of those islands are inhabited. Some of the islands might have about 400 people living on them, and others would have 1,000, and one had 200,000. It's in Southeast Asia, at the bottom of India, and then Sri Lanka, and then it's down towards the equator, so it was very hot and very beautiful. It's one of the only 200% Muslim countries in the world, the other one being Saudi Arabia. It's very different from Saudi, it's much more liberal, but you can't be a Maldivian unless you're a Muslim. So that had its own sort of influence on the work. VSO I've spoken about, they work in developing countries, and development is largely about the economic development of a country and what we used to call third world countries, and fortunately we don't say that anymore, but that's where VSO work. And the Maldives College of Higher Education is now the University of Maldives. Okay, if you could just ignore them for a minute and listen to me. This links very much with Echo's presentation about the idea of collectivism. So in Western society, we talk a lot about individualist theories, and the focus is on about the about the individual. It's based on helping the counselling here is based on helping the client to have independent thought, to become separate from family and community in terms of the way they behave. The idea is about unhooking ourselves from the approval of people. So basically, certainly one of the approaches that I was using there was the person-centred approach, and that is really about the person getting in touch with who they are, as separate from other members of their family and community. Whereas in collectivist societies, people are very interdependent, and they have to consider family and community in decision-making and actions. And indeed, often adult children ask advice from the elders in the family. Just going to get a drink of water, excuse me. I was thinking about one young man that I was working with. While I was there, I had to have a small caseload because I was teaching. And if you teach in counselling, you have to be in practice. And there was a young man that I was working with, he was talking about, he had a real bully of a dad. And if I was working with him here, well, I did say this. I said, well, couldn't you leave home? Couldn't you find somewhere else to live? And he looked at me as if I had two heads. He said, what, and leave my mother and my nephews and nieces and family? And it was just, there were so many moments of realisation for me about the things that I was saying that were, really unthinkable in this particular culture. And just to look, you're probably all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't know Maslow, go and read about Maslow because everybody in the world knows. But Maslow talks about, there's a very Western way of looking at self-actualisation. And when you get to the top of the tree with Maslow's hierarchy, it's about reaching your individual potential. Whereas Pinto talks about, yes, we have the primary needs, but the next layer up is about pleasing and satisfying the group. And in Western theories of counselling, we talk about people being people pleasers, and it's really pathologised in the Western discourse on counselling. Good name and reputation are really important, where in Western therapies you might be saying, stop worrying about what other people think about you. What's important is, what do you really need? And you get to the top of the self-actualisation in the collectivist hierarchy, and that is honour. So very much at odds with some of the Western theories of counselling. So the person-centred therapy is a Western theory of therapy, And it was Carl Rogers, who's an American, who wrote this in 1951, and it's still very prevalent in the counselling world now. So he talks about client autonomy, and again, like I said, it's about focusing on the emergence of the real self, the real you, and the part of you that is previously constrained by the needs for approval. And what Rogers talks about, the real self, the way that you work in therapy with for this part of us to emerge, is that if there are 3 particular conditions in place, and it's what we call the core conditions, then therapeutic movement will take place. And he talks about congruence, and this is about where the therapist is very open, very real, very transparent with the client, very honest with the client. And there's an example by Means and Thorne where they talk about, in one of their books, and they've written extensively about the person-centred approach, and a client said, "Are you irritated with me?" And he stopped and he said, "Yeah, I am a little bit irritated. Yeah, I am." And this is the idea of congruence. This is the idea of building trust in your client, because if you're straight with your clients and you tell the truth and you say exactly as it is, then the clients will trust you. An unconditional positive regard is about being non-judgmental. It's about accepting the client exactly as they are, putting the behavioural stuff to one side and accepting them as the person that they are. And empathy is about developing a deep understanding of what it is like to be this client. What's it like to be this person in front of me? So developing a deep understanding of the person is important. However, there are assumptions in here about the universalism of these things. And here in the UK, my experience is that this works, that people are valued and prized. But there's a cross-cultural critique of this. So if we look at a cross-cultural perspective of congruence, of this, lovely honesty and transparency, Nipoda talks about working with Japanese clients, and calls attention to the client's sense of hierarchy. And what she says is that clients may prefer the therapist to take an authoritative stance, where the therapist is honoured by the client. And she highlights the way that Japanese clients refer to her as sensei, meaning teacher or master, which is how Japanese people often refer to doctors or officials. And when we talk about unconditional positive regard, the question is, can this meet the needs of Muslims who live by Islamic principles? Reward for conformity and punishment for contravention. So the Quran and the Hadith offer a clear path for living one's life according to Allah's will. And any transgressions will be punishable on the Day of Judgment. So Muslim clients may be looking for support in maintaining the rules of their religion, and seeking guidance for a way of life that brings peace through obedience. And there may be a more suitable paradigm for working with Muslim clients. This is the Islamic concept of self, and as I was thinking about this when you were talking about the heart echo, and Inyat talks about the heart being the centre of the Islamic concept of self. So in this model, the goal of life is to cleanse the heart, and it's to educate and transform the self and to find Allah. Sound mental health, therefore, is related to a true or clean heart, which means a sense of calm. And mental distress is attributable to an incongruent heart or an unstable soul which is lost and disconnected from Allah. So this is where I started to realise that maybe we need to look at other ways of working with clients in the islands. I still haven't had a drink of this water yet, excuse me. Okay, going back to empathy. One of the writers on empathy is somebody called Ham, and she looks at a different... empathy has a pervasive presence in the Western literature on counselling, and when they were looking at the cultural construction of empathy, they were drawing a distinction between Asian and Western ideas of empathy. So Ham suggests that while Western counsellor training in empathy is thought to be a skill that can be taught, and certainly when I was teaching this, empathy was one of the big, issues that students had to develop over the couple of years. What she says is that in Asian culture it is inextricably linked to philosophy and religion, such as Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism. And within Ham's definition, empathy is regarded as a necessity in maintaining harmony, and it's a social construct. So again, it's a different sort of way of looking at empathy. And finally, I wanted to put this in because there's a strong emphasis on expressing feelings in Western counselling. I've had many clients sit and talk to a cushion and pretend it was somebody else and say it like it really is. But the findings show that while individualist cultures find other people's expression of anger tolerable, those in collectivist cultures may not. In the Maldives, expressing strong feelings is socially sanctioned, and being measured, even during times of terrible grief, is expected. And this is an aspect of the Quran. In the Western theories of bereavement, we're taught to expect strong expressions of anger, and often anger with God. And that would be unthinkable in Muslim culture. While I was there, shortly after I arrived, there was a football match going on between two islands, and there was a group going over to one of the other islands. It was a large group of people going over to support their team, and it was overloaded and the boat sank. And while a lot of people survived, 21 people lost their lives, including some small children. And some of my students were working with the mothers of these small children. And they talked about, it is not for me to question Allah's will. So even in the face of the worst experiences possible, there's an expectation to keep a lid on very strong feelings, an expression of those feelings. However, in the Quran there is a recognition of the extent of that level of grief, and that parents who survive the loss of children are guaranteed a place in heaven. Okay. Again, on the strong expression of feelings, Nipoda, the Japanese therapist who works with Japanese clients in the UK, she noted that Japanese children learn from childhood to agree with others. And she says it's inconceivable to create conflict by saying no or putting one's own needs above those of other people. And even a small refusal to something trivial can be seen as quite a major rejection. And I actually found this to my cost. What I found when I was working there, I might ask somebody to help me with something or do something, and they would always say yes and then not turn up. And this is people who I had a lot of respect for, a lot of integrity, and I just didn't get it. And slowly I began to realise that there's these kind of little nuances of communication, that there was their mouth might be saying yes, but actually their body language was saying, I can't really do this, but I can't say no. So there's a very high value placed on politeness in some collectivist cultures, and often more important than being honest in the moment. Now, it'd be very easy to think, oh, Maldivians tell lies and they're unreliable, but actually this is a cultural issue that we need to look at. This idea about saying no, I teach assertiveness here, and it's often, we talk about helping people to refuse requests, helping them to say no, and we've got a multi-million-pound self-help book industry here that talks about, how to get what you want, how to say no when your body's saying yes. Okay. Just to look at the ethical and professional issues, one of the issues that we talk about is when we're assessing clients' mental health at the beginning of therapy, a piece of therapy, is that we look at suicidal ideation just to make sure that they're not at risk. And when I went to the Maldives, I was talking about this, as you do with your students, and they were all kind of looking at each other like this and looking at me and as if to say, who's going to tell her? And then one young man, he said, Barbara, he said, in our culture, it's one way down, straight to hell. So we talked about what that meant, and suicide is illegal, but also what he said was that clients would find it really offensive if you suggested for a moment that they might be suicidal. So we came round to talking about how we deal with it, and we decided that they weren't going to use that word. But talking to a friend, a Maldivian friend afterwards, she'd said that there had been 2 suicides that week. There'd been a young boy on one of the islands who'd hanged himself and a young woman that had jumped from a tall building. So we had to revisit that. None of that would have been in the papers, and in the statistics on suicide, you won't find that in many Muslim countries, statistics on suicide at all. There's also the issue about time. In my teaching and practice as a psychotherapist, you know, my diary is, you know, everything is sort of diaried in from 1 hour to the next. When I went to the Maldives, I found things quite different. There's a funny little, if you're late, if you're early, you're neurotic. If you're on time, you're anxious, and if you're late, you're hostile. And it's a humorous nod towards Western relationship to time, and the importance that therapists place on their diaries and time. And I remember there's a couple of stories here. One was, I'd turned up for a meeting that I'd been invited to, and I showed up and somebody said, "Oh, it's been cancelled, didn't anybody tell you?" And I said, "No, they haven't told me." And this was a series of things. It was like being very tutty and superior. Don't these people use diaries? And then a few days later, I was flying over the islands in a seaplane, and I looked down, and there was a little clump of green, and I was laughing to myself. I thought, why did I think that they were thinking about diaries? Because they were thinking about whether the boats would come back in, whether the fish would be sufficient, whether there'd be enough. So I kind of got over myself a bit, and I kind of learnt to shrug. And after work every day, about 2:30, I used to go and watch The Simpsons in my little tiny apartment. And then one Monday afternoon at about 3:00, there was a knock on the door. And it was a client that I was due to see the following day. She said, "I couldn't come tomorrow, so I came today." So I just went like that, turned The Simpsons off and pressed on. So, the relationship to time is very different. It's very much more synchronous rather than, the way that we look at time here. The other thing is about counsellor self-care. There's this very rigid way of looking at, we have it's mandated for in the ethical codes. You've got to look after yourself, don't take on too many clients, etc., etc. And some of these students were already working with 20 and 30 clients a week. When I was teaching counselling here, we would say to students, just take 2 on initially and build up to maybe about 4, and that will do you for your whole placement. These students were working relentlessly. And it became a real issue in the end, because one of the main findings to come out of this research for me was that I was taking a Western, quite well-established course and putting it into a place where the infrastructure was just not there. This was the first counselling course in the country that was a generic counselling course. And I don't know why I assumed that there would be a code of ethics and a professional body and stuff. Of course I knew, but I chose to ignore it. How am I doing for time? Okay. These are some of the specific issues that we worked with, and I'm going to do a quick death by PowerPoint by running through some of the findings. Some of the findings and recommendations were introduce telephone counselling skills and introduce online counselling skills into the skills module. You can imagine why. It was very difficult to get off the islands, so that only the people of Mali were able to access the services of counsellors while I was there. It could take 2 days for somebody to get there. If they were coming from the south of the country and they were trying to get to Mali, they'd have to stop on the way. And for an hour, it was an awful lot. So I would definitely recommend introducing counselling skills and online counselling skills. I would introduce couples counselling module. The Maldives has got the highest divorce rate in the world, and that's for a number of reasons. One is that in Islam you can't have sexual relationships outside marriage, so people got married very young. And also in the Quran there's an expectation that you will get married young, have lots of children. And at that time when I was there, it's changing now, but at the time, if a man wanted to divorce his wife, he would just say, "I divorce you" 3 times. So in the heat of a big argument, he would divorce her, and then when if it had all died down and wanted to marry her again, he wasn't allowed to until he'd married somebody else in between. So to marry the same person twice, you had to marry someone else in between, and you could only have 3 such cycles. But even then, you could have been married 9 times. But even then, if you gave a donation to charity, they would let you off and let you get married again. So, you know, I often joke about this, but actually, if you had to get married every time you had sex with someone here, probably people here would be married a few times as well. Don't take that. Okay. I would invite an imam to come talk to the students about prayer in counselling. A lot of people came to counselling with students and talked about they weren't doing their 5 prayers a day and they wanted help with that. I would change the diversity module to be more locally appropriate. I would introduce the Islamic concept of self to the students, and I would modify the teaching on domestic violence to be more culturally relevant. The message for Western counsellors in working with domestic violence is get out now, make a safety plan, run away, pack a bag, tell the police. In the Maldives, it's difficult enough to get off the islands in a medical emergency, let alone run away from a violent partner. Families would send them home to their husband, the island chief would send them home to their husband, and may also be related to the husband. So what we were looking at was getting the imams to talk about, what was appropriate, perhaps in the mosque on a Friday, and talk about domestic violence as being inappropriate and unacceptable under Islam. Modify the module on working with survivors of sexual abuse. In the Western theories, there's a strong emphasis on disclosing abuse and also helping survivors to see that they are not responsible. However, disclosures in some cultures can end in death or even forced marriage to the abuser. And how can someone not feel to blame for their own victimisation when they're likely to be convinced of having sex outside marriage, convicted of having sex outside marriage or flogged for adultery? Merabi's work on Muslim suicide involves helping the client to accept the family is not responsible and that a suicide was not preventable. The young woman that I interviewed, her sister had killed herself some years previously, and in the Maldives you're not allowed to grieve in the way that other people are allowed to grieve for normal bereavement. So they couldn't have a normal burial, they couldn't have the prayers, the 40 days of prayers afterwards, they couldn't have people coming and doing the praying. So she was very hurt and very bitter, this young woman, about the way that her grief had been disenfranchised by the politics. She advocates highlighting to clients that people who kill themselves often have severe mental distress and that Allah can forgive, and it is wrong to assume that all suicides are not forgiven. And working with bereaved clients, often in the bereavement work here in the UK, we talk about letting go, moving on, whereas in other cultures, and in Chinese culture, there's an idea that the deceased person remains an important person in decision making in families after death. Final part, death by PowerPoint. This was about the infrastructure. Establish a professional body for counsellors, create a code of ethics for local people, not the British Association for Counselling, create a mandate for clinical supervision, limit the number of clients to be seen in a week, organise an annual conference, this is the postdoctoral research, facilitate a course in supervision for 20 Maldivian counsellors, organise a public awareness campaign, put 2 more courses on satellite islands in the north and south of the country. And just to... That's how it was supposed to be. Thank you very much.